Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES is a non-profit, non-governmental organization that supports electoral processes, broadly defined, across the world. And we have assisted elections in European countries since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This is the 16th installment in our series. We've covered issues from election administration, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of the Russian government in European politics. If you have missed any of our previous discussions, you can find recordings of all of them on our YouTube channel. My colleague is putting a link to that in the chat right now. I'm Magnus Öhman. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor. I'm also Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office in the Czech Republic, and we are hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance, with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices, and is made possible through the generous support of the American people. So our focus today is on the current and future role of political parties in European countries. Political parties are often put forward as a key actor in our democratic process, although declining membership figures and declining trust is often portrayed as concerns. But in many European countries, party membership has been on a decline since the 1980s, and anti-establishment movements have been significantly active in many European countries for many years now. Given this, what is the role of political parties in European elections and politics? And what is the impact of this for democracy? What can be done to strengthen the position of political parties in the democratic dialogue? Or are there other forms or structures that can take over the role of political parties? To learn more about this topic, we have with us prominent experts on political and electoral processes. I'll start by exploring the general issue of the role of political parties in democratic societies, together with Anthoula Malkopoulou, Associate Professor and Senior Lecturer at the Department of Political Science, Lund University in Sweden. We'll then look at the empirical situation of political parties in Europe, together with Oskar Hultin Bäckersten, doctoral candidate at the Department of Government in Uppsala University. We'll then turn to two persons with decade-long experience of working within political parties, and also in supporting political parties in different countries. First out will be Lolita Cigane, international consultant in elections and good governance, also a former member of parliament in her native Latvia. We'll then talk to Birgitta Ohlsson, Director of Political Parties at the National Democratic Institute, also a former member of parliament, in this case in Sweden, and a former Minister of Democracy Affairs and European Businesses. Finally, I'll turn to Anthony Bowyer as Advisor for Europe and Eurasia at IFES to talk about current challenges and assistance that can help to address those challenges in European countries today. We'll then open for questions, so for discussion. If you have any questions, you can already now type those in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So first, let me turn to Anthoula Malkopoulou at the Department of Political Science, Lund University. And Anthoula, let's start from the beginning. Do we really need political parties for democracy to function?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Yes, my answer is clear yes. In modern representative democracies, the ones we have, which are large scale and mass democracies, we do need political parties. And we need them to perform a number of functions. One is to coordinate collective action. And the other is to bring society close to government, connect society and government and they do that by raising representative claims to represent different actors of society by doing that, they also set political agendas. And what is perhaps even more important is that parties create political divisions, not along kinship and essentialist lines, but along ideological lines. So they organize political division and political competition ideologically, if you like. That's what parties do. And another also very crucial function is that they offer public justifications for the different policy proposals that they bring in. And when I say public justifications, I mean justifications that are based on broadly shared terms, such as non-discrimination or fairness, and not on the basis of partial interests, such as the self-interest of a specific group. So they do offer shared visions, and they do speak on these terms and organize political society ideologically.
Okay, I guess we shouldn't treat all political parties the same, though. From your perspective, does it make sense to talk about good parties and bad parties?
Well, I assume so, because the parties that do not perform the functions that I just outlined could be described as bad parties. So, for example, parties that only cater for partial interests and with no consideration for the public good would be doing a disservice to democracy, or parties that only serve to promote the careers of their members, and parties that systematically lie or manipulate their audience. And of course, in the last years, we have a special worry for parties that pose as the true voice of the people, as an embodiment of the people. And these parties are considered bad because they are usually also engaged in unfair competition, and they try to delegitimize their opponents as being outside of the political community that these parties claim to represent. So yes, there are bad parties.
Well, given what you've just been saying, is there a need to regulate political parties?
Yes, I believe so. We should regulate both to protect them and to prevent them from abusing democratic procedures. And they should be protected both indirectly by protecting basic civil and political rights, freedom of expression and association, on which freedoms that parties really are based on and apply better than any other organization. But they should also be protected directly as associations that perform a very vital and crucial function for democracy. So, for example, they should receive public funding in order to protect them from undue influence from corporate interests, and also in order to create a level playing field among political parties that may not have equal access to resources. But even so, even with public funding, we see that representational inequalities persist. And we see that male, older, white, and relatively affluent persons are members of parliament disproportionately compared to the numbers in the population. So therefore, some have suggested an alternative way of selection, such as a random selection of citizens to complement membership in legislative bodies. And these kind of mini publics or citizen parliamentarians would operate not on antagonistic lines as parties, but more on cooperative principles. But they come with their own problems, but there are alternatives that are tried in many parts of the world.
Thank you very much. As my final question, I want to go back to the issue we talked about, good versus bad parties. These parties who do not behave in the way that you were outlining, how do we deal with them?
Yes, there is a very heated disagreement about party bans lately, and there are people who believe parties that are anti-democratic, racist, sexist should be possible to be banned. And others would say that such a practice is illegitimate because it will restrict freedom of expression and association. So party bans should, in principle, not be allowed, and we should engage in, punishing regular crimes that party members may be involved in, such as what happened with Golden Dawn, for example. But now, because the debate on banning or not is kind of restricted, there's more and more people who, including our own research group, that looks into social reasons behind the emergence of such parties and the success of such parties. And we look at social insecurities, inequalities, and social issues that explain their emergence, and try to target those instead of focusing on legally addressing parties that do not live up to the expectations we have from parties in a well-functioning democracy.
Thank you very much, Anthoula Malkopoulou from the Department of Political Science at Lund University. I also love the picture that you have behind you. I need to translate for our audience. The people are demonstrating in favor of universal suffrage. Let's turn now to Oskar Hultin Bäckersten, who is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Government at Uppsala University. Oskar, in a similar trend, what would you say is the state of political parties in European countries today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me for this very interesting discussion. It's obviously a quite hard question to answer, and it depends a lot on your perspective, and I'm sure we are going to hear answers from some different perspectives today. But coming from the traditional party studies, in particular in Europe, I think the answer would generally be that parties are in some form of crisis. But of course, a possible problem with that diagnosis is that it has been around for a long time. As I think you said in your introduction, some of these figures, party membership, for instance, has been decreasing for quite a long time. People have been talking about some form of decline of political parties for some time. And perhaps if they are in a permanent state of crisis, you cannot really talk about a crisis anymore. But still, I think there are some issues that this whole idea of party crisis highlights, and I am drawing on one of the most prominent party scholars of our time, the late Peter Mayer, who opened his 2013 book called "Ruling the Void" with the line that the age of party democracy has passed, which is of course a very dramatic verdict. But the issue then would be not so much that the parties are in crisis, but that they are not able to perform what he sees as their most important democratic functions. That is to organize the citizenry to the extent that they have before. And he has this idea of a mutual withdrawal from what he calls the zone of engagement, the public arena, participation in political parties, where parties retreat into the institutions of the state and citizens retreat into private life or possibly into ad hoc movements to seek political change in single issues, but not in seeking the long-term and the more coherent ways of affecting politics through political parties. But just a final note, this point still that parties as such might not be in any form of crisis. Still, party government is the only game in town in the sense that parties are still the only organizations running for election. We see a lot of new parties having at least some electoral success, but broadly parties are not engaging the citizenry to the same extent as before.
Oskar, whether or not crisis is the right concept, what are the reasons for the current situation and the development that we've seen in recent years?
Well, that is one of the hardest questions, I think, to answer. But I think a reason why scholars call it a party crisis, at least, is to look at some of the indicators. And the most clear is political participation in the parties, in particular membership numbers. And as you said, this decline has been around for a long time. In 1960, average party membership in Europe was about 15% of the electorate. And today it is, or really 10 years ago, it was around 4%. While there is there is some research, but not collected in the same way for the last decade, this pattern seems to hold. Although there are some nuances. You can find, of course, parties that run counter to this trend. You can find some countries where engagement in parties is increasing. But still, these numbers show that trust in parties, for instance, is low or declining. Membership in parties is generally low or declining. But the conundrum here is that people are interested in politics to the same extent as before. At least they say so in surveys. The education levels are increasing, which political scientists always before has thought of as one of the most important factors if you want to increase political participation. Turnout, electoral turnout in most countries is relatively stable or even increasing in some parts of, I'm speaking mostly of Europe. At least it is not unequivocally decreasing to some extent that these numbers of engagement in parties. So it is really about about participation in parties, all these attitudes and behaviors related to parties that are declining or at very low levels.
Okay, but I'm not going to keep pushing. We're talking about declining participation. What are the reasons for participation declining in European countries?
Well, again, I think you can look at this from many angles, of course, you can look at, so why are people not engaged in parties anymore? Has something changed? And there are some very broad theses that have been proposed, such as partisan de-alignment, that people are not aligning in the same way along, for instance, the left-right political scale, or not finding themselves as closely connected to a particular position on the scales, on the dimensions that political parties are competing on. A broader theme of individualization of politics, perhaps most clearly connected to Ronald Englehart's thesis of the post-materialist values that make people less probable to participate in these conventional forms of politics. But you can also look at party level explanations and that to come back to Peter Mayer, I think is an explanation that has been quite prominent in research on political parties, such as the idea that parties are cartelizing, that they are becoming more parts of the state rather than a part of civil society, which also reduces competition from new parties, for instance. And it could also be seen as a strategic response from the political parties in response to declining levels of engagement from the citizenry. But this theory at least would suggest that it is the parties that are withdrawing from civil society and are at least partly to blame. And I think there we could also talk about better and worse parties in the sense that parties are, of course, also able to some extent to affect how possible it is for people to engage in parties and so on.
Okay, a lot of problems, a lot of challenges. Let me ask you a final question then, and try. Let's move to solutions. What can be done to reverse this negative trend, if anything?
Well, I'm not sure that the party research tradition has the best answers to this, and I think perhaps we will hear some other experiences from people who have actually been engaged in parties and trying to look at this from that perspective at least. But in this research tradition, I think everyone wants this mass party back when a large part of the electorate was engaged as party members, or at least they voted and aligned themselves with political parties to a larger extent. Of course, it's debatable, as always, when you talk about these kinds of golden ages, whether they ever existed. But you can see some examples of parties that are doing better. But for instance, the Labour Party in Great Britain, they saw a sharp increase of membership. But the issue with this is that it seems to be quite fickle. So you can have a movement of a surge of membership, if you will, but it seems hard to sustain an increase in party membership and keep it at that increased level. There have also been some reforms that parties have tried to respond by, for instance, introducing elections of leaders by ballot. And while that might be good in some ways, it does not seem to be a clear solution for increasing party membership. But another solution on the same topic that has been suggested by party scholars and is also experimented with is to make parties more democratic in the sense that they are becoming more forums for deliberation, that party members are also invited to participate in formulating the political aims of the party, for instance, and not only cast a vote on a membership ballot or send a representative to a party conference or something like that.
Thank you very much, Oskar Hultin Bäckersten from Uppsala University. And we'll turn now from an academic perspective to the view from people who have been active within political parties for a very long time and who've also worked with and supported political parties in different countries. We'll turn first to Lolita Cigane, international consultant in elections and good governance, former member of parliament and former chair of the European Affairs Committee in her native Latvia. Lolita, we've heard from our panelists a lot about the challenges that political parties face and in representing people. Given your lengthy experience of working with this, what's your view of the role of political parties in Europe today and in the future?
Thank you, Magnus. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to participate in this conversation about such a core institution to all democracies, political parties. And indeed, I have to first say that the time when I started working in active politics and ran as a candidate and was elected to parliament coincided with a time when internet and online usage started becoming prevalent. And that was in 2010. And at that time, basically everyone who was analyzing and advising on how to conduct campaigns, everyone was saying that just go online. No one is going to use the analog media anymore. No television. Who cares about print media? Just go online, be active in the social networks, and your campaign be fine. And of course, that was a time when we all were a bit kind of idealistically eyed about what role internet is going to play in politics. And we were all viewing it from the perspective of really giving the platforms and possibilities for individual participation and also for individual candidate promotion in terms of explaining the positions and platforms and so on. Of course, now we have much advanced, and with the advancement, there have been quite a lot of also negative side effects that we've started realizing about this whole internet world. And we have realized that still a lot of population, actually, a lot of voters, a lot of citizens, they still live in this analog space, so to say, and still derive a lot of campaign-related information from the more traditional ways of campaigning. And I definitely observed this just now when I worked with OSCE ODIHR, election assessment mission in Germany, as if a very advanced democracy, but still the main, the core forms of campaigning, despite the whole pandemic and COVID time, were still the guiding ones and were to a large extent defining campaigns. And of course, this brings me further to the question about the role of political parties. At some point, and it coincided with this increase and rise of internet in terms of campaigning, there was a general feeling that political parties have declined to the extent that they will be replaced by non-state actors, and they will have to move somewhere to the side of political spectrum. And of course, this hasn't happened because, especially in the crisis time, we have all asked and waited for collective action in terms of proposing solutions and giving clear policy guidance. And this has had to come from concrete, organized, and what is even more important, accountable organizations. And these organized, accountable, and continuous organizations are political parties. So basically, I think that we have already moved beyond the debate whether political parties are a phenomena that is to stay. Of course, this is a phenomena that is here to stay, and most likely they will continue to be the core of democracies. And then the question is how we look into organizing structures and organizing institutions of political parties so that to make them even more transparent, even more accountable, and even more inclusive. And throughout the whole tenure of 8 years, when I was the member of parliament, we always had the debates as to what extent the state should regulate what happens inside political parties. And of course, I think the consensus, definitely, at least in Europe, is that when it comes to, for instance, campaign and party finances, especially with a view to public funding that is being extended to political parties now in almost all, if not all, EU member states and general European countries, that definitely state has a role to regulate that. But the question still remains to what extent the state should regulate what happens in terms of transparency and inclusiveness in the political party internal work. And of course, we know that this regulation in Europe is really varied. There are different systems, different models. There are countries that require much more inclusiveness in terms of gender representation, for instance, in the governing bodies of political parties, and only then political parties can be registered to put up the candidate lists for elections. There are countries that actually regulate how candidates on candidate lists are selected, and there are countries which still feel that these are free citizen associations that should not see this very deep penetration of the state. But in general, to conclude, I think that we are definitely at the point where we are talking about the accountability mechanisms, definitely are in agreement that transparency and transparent regulation also for internal party workings is important. Whether it's positive or sanctioning action, I think it's still up for discussion, and I'm sure there are good examples and bad examples to follow.
Thank you, Lolita. We are looking at a situation of a general and seemingly permanent decline in party membership, an issue that you have been addressing. And that raises the issue, what can parties do to adopt other forms of both participation and mobilization that may be more attractive to citizens today?
Thank you, Magnus. This is a core question, actually, because obviously the traditional membership, indeed, as the previous speakers have been mentioning, is declining. And also from my experience working in political parties for many years, I have seen that the mobilization patterns of political party members have really changed. And as we have seen in other democracies, it often happens so that the most mobilized members of political parties currently are the members which, so to say, do not have much other things to do apart from participating in regular party events. And this, to a large extent, locks political parties in the past, to some extent, we can say so, because these regular attendees are the people, often in political parties, which want to see parties repeating the traditions and the ways of how they approached political business of the past. And basically, these mobilized and active members are trapping political parties in the past. And since I've had experience with 3 different political organizations, because the political party scene in Latvia is rather volatile, I have seen that there is definitely a way how to overcome this trap, I would say trap of this expectation that political parties will always stay the same and will always be the same as they used to be in the old good days. And of course, many of these ways how to overcome it is by trying to attract a more diverse body of members, by giving different avenues of participation. So not only the regular, traditional, once a week meetings in the party bureau, for instance, but more online, more digital opportunities. I have, for instance, seen that my colleagues, women politicians who have small children, they have been able to participate in political party governing bodies, meetings and conventions during COVID time, actually much more successfully, because most of the things happen online. And they can easily ask someone to take care of the kids for 1.5 hours while they are sitting in front of the computer. But it's very difficult when they have to spare 4 hours to dress nicely, to be presentable, to be present, to do the small talk, and also to actually get upset and frustrated because sometimes their time is up and they have to run home, whereas other members who don't have small children at home, they can stay on, linger on, and do the important networking. So basically, this digital world has given opportunities for more inclusive approaches. And a very interesting approach that I actually found while working was, again, OSCE, or Election Observation Mission in Mongolia, was a movement started by a new political party in Mongolia. Mongolia is a territorially huge country with a very low population density. And actually, one of the prospective presidential candidates who was not eventually nominated, she has started a party through a smartphone application where she's trying to engage rural and regional women in Mongolia to be active in party work. And of course, in this very big, dispersed and sparsely populated country, this is a huge advantage that someone who has a smartphone can log in the application for this political party and can actually actively participate, talk to the like-minded people, share the ideas, film a random video of what's happening in their particular region, and do it from their homes. And this is not the only example that can be mentioned of how this these ways of traditional political party participation can be overcome. And I think this is the future of enhanced membership.
Okay, Lolita, we're talking about changes within political parties. So I want to ask you a last question. What role do you see for party leaders and the party leadership in the different political parties in this change?
Yes, and this is again, in my opinion, a very important question when we are thinking about the future of these core democratic institutions, because obviously I think every one of us who are following the news in terms of political developments in developed, even old traditional democracies, we see this tendency of political parties either completely rallying around the leader with no criticism whatsoever, or all of a sudden falling out with the leader. And then initially everyone loves the leader, and then everyone hates the leader. And this is, of course, extremely disruptive to a political organization that needs to continue. And for that reason, actually, this brings me back to the point that we started with. what should and what could be the procedurally regulated internal political party procedures so that it wouldn't be just one person party. And this is really a problem for new and old democracies in terms of political party dynamics.
Thank you very much. And this raises a lot of issues, especially when we are dealing with parties in countries where party leaders, well, oligarchs may have significant influence over political parties. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lolita Cigane, international consultant in elections and good governance, former member of parliament in Latvia. We'll next talk to Birgitta Ohlsson, who also has extensive experience working both within and supporting political parties. Birgitta is now director of political parties at the National Democratic Institute, former member of parliament in Sweden, and former minister of European affairs and democracy issues. Birgitta, will get back to a question we've raised several times. Why parties? And since you are working a lot with party support, in your view, would you say that donors are shying away from supporting political parties?
Well, thanks first to Magnus and IFES for inviting us to this highly interesting discussion. And I mean, NDI, we are a party institute, and we worked with democratic parties across the world since 40 years back. I mean, despite their failings and weaknesses. And why do we do that? Well, that's because we firmly believe that in multi-party systems with free and fair elections, parties are still the backbone of democracy. And I mean, no one pretends that parties are perfect or wise or so, but they are there, and we need to work on their reform. On the latter part of your question, I would say that I mean, we can acknowledge that democracy support in development aid has increased steadily since the mid-1990s, but we need to have reforms. And it also seems that international democracy aid seems to be more successful historically when it comes to supporting democratization rather than we are right now, the kind of preventing the democratic backsliding. And connecting that to parties, I mean, even if we see that it has been this increase when it comes to democracy support, not much money is going to parties. And I think quite a few donors and governments think that it's far more easier to work with the civil society organization. And especially in hardship places, closing space, authoritarian areas. And it's something I think we need to have like a big shift in mentality when it comes to donors. To understand that supporting political parties, especially in fragile places, it's like running a marathon. You need to be very resilient. You need to be strategic, and you have to focus on the long run. You cannot only go for the dramatic openings of revolutions or freedom fights. You need to be there, and you need to see that it's not like programs that could go for a year or so. It needs to be more like a longer perspective to kind of recognize the need of nests, how to kind of incubate the freedom fighters.
We're talking about political parties and we're talking about reforms that come up a lot during our discussion. From your perspective, why is party reform necessary?
Well, I sometimes kind of drastically say to parties, reform or die. And my colleagues here, they mentioned before through the conversation, the declining membership, democracy not delivering, people turning away from parties, not feeling relevant. That's kind of a global wake-up call. But I think also we need to put political parties into this kind of bigger external context. I mean, right now we're living in a situation where we have corruption, we have state capture, we have populism, we have opaque party organizations. And they also undermine the public confidence in parties around the world, fueling this political instability. And parties are right now, even decent democratic parties, they're in the midst of this authoritarian perfect storm. But still political parties, and this is a global phenomenon, I think, and the global relevance, they need to do their homework. Our former NDI president, Kim Wallach, he used to say that to parties that you need to eat your broccoli. And I think that's important to realize that that working on issues like transparency, working on issues on ethical behavior, reforming internal party procedures, inclusive discussion, decision making, and so on. That's a global homework. And the flagship program that my team is running right now, it's called Win with Integrity. And that has been quite an interesting journey following this program through the last 1.5 years. And I'll drop a link later in the chat because it's interesting to see when we have been piloting this program in North Macedonia, Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, and a number of countries, we've seen that parties are kind of using this self-assessment tool to reform and also inviting the civil society organizations and being kind of frank. With my background, I've been quite amazed. And also one final thing that I want to mention here on party reform, it's important to realize that culture beats strategy. I mean, it doesn't matter how many reform programs a party is having if the internal culture is rotten. They need to live their values, they need to walk the talk. I say to parties, if you win with integrity, if you win with women, if you lead with grace, and if you if you lose with dignity, then you have kind of a good ground for most things.
Birgitta, I want to ask you an issue that has come up several times. There is absolutely no shortage of political engagement among young people today, but they don't join political parties. They don't become members of political parties. Why not?
Well, I come from the kind of old school political party structure, and for 25 years, I had a role in my party in parliament, government, leading both the youth wing and the women's wing organization. And that's a traditional liberal party with roots more than 100 years back. So when I meet young people today, I was with a passion for change, I always tell them, you should join a political party, like I did in my late teens. And that's not the case any longer. I was interviewing Vanessa Nakato, who's one of the leading global climate activists in the world a year ago, and I was asking her the same question, and I think that's a phenomenon. We see that especially many young women, Greta Thunberg from Sweden is one of them, together Vanessa and others, they are, leading global role models, and they are paving the way for some of the most important political issues that we have today. But for them, it seems like party work is not a choice, even if they live in open democracies where parties actually are pushing for their different initiatives. And I think that's something that parties need to reflect upon. And on the other hand, we know, for example, that 50% of the world's population are under the age of 30, but only 2.6% of the total numbers of parliament globally are younger than 30. And I think here we should maybe also have a renaissance in many countries for the political youthing organizations, because it is a fact that in countries, especially in Western Europe and in Scandinavia, where you've had strong political youthing organizations with kind of independent voices in the parties, you also have far more younger elected politicians. I'm also quite amazed. I'm following these movements also on a global level from all the different ideologies. And when I sometimes attend meetings, and if I reflect 20 years back when I was their age, then it was mostly, Western European young politicians meeting together. Now it's another different situation. You have young politicians and from all parts of the world. And sometimes you have the case that you have young politicians from West Africa or different Asian countries or in the Middle East that could recommend young politicians from the West on how to kind of be more successful when it comes to moving in the internal party structures and modernizing a party. So that's also something that we need to take into account.
Yeah, but what does that all mean? From your perspective, is there a conflict between the old school party structure and these new movements?
No, I wouldn't say that. And I think it's we have to kind of remember that it's not easy maybe to reform the old school parties. But the most important thing is to kind of focus on the democracy level. We also have another program at NDR, it's called the New Movement-Based Parties, where we try to navigate, to see the new patterns in this kind of democratic system. And I think everyone has been kind of shocked through the last years that we've seen that also among classical parties that they become kind of kidnapped from charlatan reformers in the century-old democracies. We've seen established parties going from movements to elite clubs far from the voters, but we've also seen the new political actors coming. And I don't think this is about making like a choice between the old school parties and the new movements. And it's not about pretending that everything new is surrounded by a political romantic shimmer and that mature parties never can change. I I think it's important here that no matter if the political parties are 100 years old, introduce democracy to their country, or if they're based on ideology, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, or so on, and no matter if the rising social movements are getting millions of activists, if they aspire to represent the citizens and get elected in free and fair elections, they should all respect and contribute to democracy. So I think that's more kind of the focus that we need to have. We should not only applaud them. They are important, and they're not created in a vacuum. I mean, they are a byproduct of the declining attitudes citizens have towards parties. It's important to have the democracy focus here for me.
I want to end with a question, a slightly different focus. We see in a number of European countries today, growing authoritarianism, a decline in public freedom, shrinking space for civil society. In that context, what is the role of political parties? Is there room for optimism?
Oh, yes, of course, we should be. To quote Secretary Albright, who is the chairperson of NDI, she says that she's the word optimist. And I think we definitely can turn this kind of autocracy Inc. to a democracy hub if we all are dedicated. I mean, we have the year of action now after the democracy summit that happened in the first one of them, December last year. And we are more aware about that authoritarians are getting smarter and more strategic. But I think there's plenty of hope. I mean, we have close to 30 countries worldwide having general elections next year. And some of these elections with very active democratic parties can be the turning point. We have pro-democracy movements that are very strong in tough dictatorship countries. And I also would like to mention that cross-party collaboration, I think, is back. That we see that opposition parties are forming new alliances despite ideological differences to kind of keep the populists out. I work a lot at NDI via the party internationals. And we've seen a great interest from different parties, no matter ideologies, that if you want to defend democracy, if you want to solve climate change and deal with future and coming pandemics, decent Democrats, they need to unite and kind of make multilateralism stronger again. So I think also there is definitely room for improvement, but there is a lot of hope. And I think sometimes it's very sad that the debate is far too negative today, and that's something that we need to change.
Thank you very much, Birgitta Ohlsson from the National Democratic Institute. And we'll turn finally to Anthony Bowyer, Advice for Europe and Eurasia at IFES. Anthony, there's a pandemic on. How have political parties in Europe altered their approaches and their activities as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Magnus. Lovely to be here this morning and this afternoon. I appreciate the question. I first wanted to identify and highlight some of the key factors just to set the stage to answer that question, if I could. As mentioned by my colleagues on the call on the event today, we have been seeing a declining influence of political parties globally, and in Europe being no exception, as evidenced by decreasing party membership, a lower voting turnout in some countries, as well as some reduced party stability. We've also seen a contraction of social bases of traditional political party support in some places, such as labor unions or churches, which perhaps portends greater volatility for some of the well-ingrained party structures and allowing new entrants onto the political scene who don't necessarily embrace the democratic values. I think as well, some of the recent survey data shows among European countries not so positive views of the existing political parties, but also as well, not necessarily of the populist parties that have been increasing in popularity and have been springing on the political scene more lately. I think that while perhaps weakened in a weakened state, or it's perceived to be at times political parties have been unattractive, there's nonetheless a key mechanism of ensuring democratic accountability, and they remain the essential lifeblood of a democratic system of government as vehicles for representation of political expression. As well, we know declining political party system bodes very poorly for democracy in general, as lack of interest among voters or allowing representative governance to stagnate is really an open door. It's an invitation for forces bent on undermining democracy and the narrow pursuit of power, influencing their supporters by hate over hope, by disinformation over fact, and by personal ambition over ideas and policies for the good of all. With respect to COVID, I think we've certainly seen a kind of retreat from populist parties in some countries. I'm going to say North America, US may be an exception, but we see maybe more of a interest in technocratic governance, more of a return to trusted political structures, to science, and so forth, as well as certainly the bounds of communication between political parties and constituents and potential members has been altered as well, as mentioned by colleagues in the call in the event, that the nature of communication has really evolved to more online types of forms. And while this does have some advantages for perhaps allowing greater engagement by some voters and actors who are not otherwise engaged, it also has reduced this element of traditional campaigning, as mentioned by a colleague as well, which is all so important in really attracting and retaining support. There's the traditional meeting and greeting, shaking of hands, getting to know constituents. That really difficult work, the groundwork that is done by political parties and by candidates is very, very important for attracting and retaining support. And I think that's one of the issues, is retaining the interest over the longer term to revitalize democracy and ensure that in the future representative governance is thriving.
Anthony, in this discussion series, we have had reason to come back several times to the influence of the Russian government over politics in European countries, an issue that arguably is particularly important right now. From your perspective, what is the influence of Kremlin on European elections and political parties in particular, and how has that impacted voter attitudes towards political parties and the engagement in the decision-making process?
Indeed, this is not certainly a new phenomenon. This has really picked up steam, if you will, since around about 2014 in Europe and well beyond. And I think it to some degree may coincide with the emergence of more populist and extremist leaders and elements. The no surprise. And I think that all of the political parties in countries in Europe, in established democracies and emerging democracies, will need to adapt their approaches to counter challenges from extremist movements and leaders, to bridge increasing sociocultural economic divide that exacerbates inequity, and address the increasing prevalence of disinformation and external challenges, such as which you allude to now, that have served to discredit political parties and undermine democracy. We know in recent history that interests from some countries and interference by the Kremlin in particular, and funding from certain oligarchs has been influential in political parties in Europe. In fact, they have served to also create, to cause disruption and confusion and dismay by this traditional hack and discredit operation, which has undermined the legitimacy of certain candidates, served to scandalize the election process, caused uncertainty among voters, and frankly, concern that of the type of democratic system that they have, and undermined its ultimate legitimacy, and therefore casting doubt on the legitimacy of the outcome. This creation of confusion and doubt really opens the door to not only chaos and disruption of the democratic status, but also allows elements, non-traditional elements, to use disinformation and negative messaging further to divide society. And I think this is something certainly I would argue in the US we've seen, but in Europe we have seen over the last several years, and in several countries, in the UK and in France. There certainly was an operation in Montenegro that took place, in Germany in recent elections. And this, unfortunately, the problem is not decreasing. If anything, it is getting worse. And these represent threats not just to the voting process, but also to, frankly, to critical electoral infrastructure via cyber attacks.
Okay, well, let's look at solutions for now. What can be done to increase citizen interest in political parties in European countries?
So I think there's a number of things that can be done to reassure voters that political parties have their interests. I mean, we certainly have seen parties kind of gravitate toward the center, and this has allowed perhaps more extreme views to become prevalent on the margins. I think certainly political parties need to reinforce their base and to appeal to the base, but they also have to, at the same time, reach out to this middle of the road voter, which, as we know, is typically the majority in any country. But I think there's also an element of understanding and helping voters to understand that parties represent their greater interest, that they are honest in their dealings, and this we've seen such an increase in negative rhetoric, with or without alleged Kremlin interference in politics over the last several years. I think we need parties to pledge to disavow negative politics. I know that's almost impossible to do, but it would certainly restore confidence in among voters in elections generally, and the traditional political party structures and leaders. We also need, frankly, as others have said, young, dynamic leadership in these parties. We have a number of growing majority of younger and upcoming voters and new and first-time voters in countries in Europe and around the world. And they perhaps don't necessarily relate to some of the party leaders that are at the helm of their traditional parties. We need to see a greater connection between younger party leaders using new media to reach out and attract and retain interest in young people in the election process and in democratic governance more broadly. And I would say that, Magnus, that goes even deeper. I think we also have to consider greater emphasis on educating students, both in universities and even younger students, as to what participatory democracy means, and to really embrace this. This is the future of a democracy. IFES has had the opportunity to work in support of a number of programs that provide civics classes and coursework to universities and to high school students, by which they form their own political parties and have mock elections. And it's great, and there's a lot of interest around that process, but to sustain it is something that perhaps represents a greater challenge. But to understand the importance of serving one's community ultimately, be it through one's personal action or through participation in political parties, is absolutely essential to the long-term success of democracy in Europe.
Well, to build on that, my final question, what is IFES doing to support equal playing field for all political actors?
Well, we've had a wonderful relationship over the years with our good friends and partners at NDI and IRI and many other European organizations to work to increase the role of political parties in helping to make new decisions, to make changes, positive changes to electoral legislation, working, of course, with authorities, to understand the regulations regarding campaign and political finance, for example, which contribute to a level playing field. Also looking at regulations on electoral dispute adjudication, working to build trust and relationship between election management bodies and political parties. And we know, of course, that in many countries, political party representatives are part of the election administrative structures as election officers. And I think we need to continue building this kind of code of ethics to put the greater interest of the election ahead of any party interests. As well, I think we need to continue to promote inclusivity of the electoral process, including persons with disabilities to a far greater degree in roles of leadership. We also need to continue working in the area of media training and use of information, quite frankly. And as mentioned before, I think, again, embracing the upcoming generation of voters through greater engagement with young people and really elevating their interests more prominently as part of the political party emphasis.
Thank you very much, Anthony Bowyer from IFES. We'll now take questions to our panelists. If you do have a question, type that in using the Q&A button. While you're typing away, I will read out some questions that have come in so far. The first question, I think we'll address this to Oskar, Hultin, and Bäckersten. There's been a discussion about the falling membership of political parties, but is there any research, any data on who or what type of people who've stayed in parties or who have then become members of parties? In other words, who are the party members today in the European context?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I don't have the particular data in front of me, but I do know some things about the state of the research on this. And well, party membership numbers have been declining for a long time, and they've declined very significantly in a lot of European countries. The type of members in terms of their socio-demographic characteristics or income or education and things like that has not changed that much. It has been a worry of political scientists, obviously, that you would find those who remain in parties would be very different from the electorate at large, or not be very representative. And while there have for a long time been some over-representation of some groups, for instance, of men, and of that party members tend to be slightly older than the electorate at large, slightly more educated. That has not really changed that much with members leaving the parties. So that might be a surprising pattern, and I think it surprises most of these people who have studied it at first, but it is the general pattern, I would say, clearly.
Thank you very much. We have another question which is addressed to Anthoula in particular. You've been talking about, we talked about good and bad parties. And the question is, how can we tell the difference? And what can be done to turn a bad party into a good one? Easy question.
Yeah, not so easy. Thank you. That's interesting. How can we tell? Well, I have outlined a few ideas of how we kind of can identify them. It all depends, of course, on how you define democracy and the type of democratic system in place. But if we are to consider parties having certain ethical responsibilities, such as to always talk in the name of the public good and not partial interests, to be and to engage in fair terms of competition, these are some kind of minimum requirements. Then you would easily identify those who do not do that as being the bad parties. But in terms of trying to bring them, make them good again, let's say, there are again different theories. But so the ones who are against party bans would say that we should include and never ban a party because their experience of participating in regular party politics will eventually make them more moderate and more compromising and more kind of civil, if you like. So that's one approach. Others who are more pessimistic would say that you should certainly, whatever you do, they will always try to come back just in more clandestine versions. For example, if you ban X party, they will come back concealing their true kind of racist agenda. And eventually, if they come to power, this will come back. If they are, as we saw, for example, in Turkey with the now governing party, that first time around it was banned, and then it came back in a more moderate version. But once in government, we see that it has gone back to its old kind of more dangerous, if you like, version. So there are different options and different theories out there.
Thank you very much, Anthoula. The question has come in to Birgitta. Given that you support that NDI and yourself are given to political parties. So basically, the question is there a risk that you support parties that may be very democratic and very nice and very inclusive, etc., but that have no influence on politics in the particular country where they're functioning, especially in countries where one party dominates the political scene?
Thank you so much. I think that's a very relevant question. And I think it's important to realize that political parties do not need to be perfect to be part of reform work, but they need to have a will to reform. I think that's very important. And I think also from historical reasons, especially connected to development aid. I mean, we've had quite a few examples through history where governments, including the Swedish government, from where I was active in politics, they'd support the wrong actors, and development aid could also be something that made them stay in power for far too long. So I think that's also important. But you need to have the will. You need to have kind of the embryo of change. And just touching base shortly on the Women Integrity program that we have at NDI. The kind of laws that we've seen is that it can be different political goals that the different parties are living up to when it comes to having more female politicians elected. It could be introducing bylaws. It could be a financial framework. It could be a variety of different things where parties actually do promise to do something, and that we've seen that they are truly committed. I was kind of amazed when we started these programs that parties were so frank about talking about their internal problems with other parties and with civil society organizations. So I think parties understand that if you're not reforming, then they will not get voters. At least some do that.
Thank you very much, Birgitta. The question for Anthony: we were talking about the influence of the Kremlin, of the Putin regime, and the question is. And it's a little bit similar to a question I asked Birgitta earlier. Should we see political parties in Europe as a threat or as a tool, in this case, that Kremlin can use to undermine democracy, or are they a protection against such influence?
Well, I think it potentially is both. I mean, I think certainly political parties are the ultimate guardians of the democratic process. At the same time, we talked about good parties and bad parties, and there are constantly new entrants onto the political scene. I think there can be parties that are used and supported to instigate challenges that are of an undemocratic nature. That's quite clear. So, again, do we establish criteria to ban or limit such parties? Some have come to power, actually. At the same time, I think you want to have an open political process that it does not exclude the interests of certain groups. At the same time, there need to be regulations on, for example, uncivil conduct and the use of disinformation as a tool in campaigning. I think this is a growing malady that elections and politics faces in many countries. So we certainly need to have an open political dialogue and not exclude groups, but at the same time, there do need to be regulations on what they can do and say if it in fact is blatantly false. And if it is divisive and disruptive to the civil democratic political process.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And I want to end with a question that's for all our panelists. And the questions come in is that several of you have mentioned that some political parties have reformed very successfully. But what are your criteria for a positive development? And can you give, and I think this is important, can you give examples of such parties and such reform initiatives? I'll open up for anyone who wants to give an answer to that.
If I may start by just saying one point since I think it's so interesting for me to hear also from you, who are perhaps representing a different angle on parties, having been engaged in parties, working with them while I and party scholars mostly study them. Because I think when we talk about these things, the reforming parties, to make them more act with more integrity, for instance, or mobilizing people online, modernizing these kinds of developments. Those may be virtues of parties, but some of them are not necessarily democratic in the sense that at least party scholars tend to think about it. The issue that has been raised in the party scholar tradition is, you could perhaps say, about the popular component of party government, that enthusing and organizing the citizenry. And while it may be very good in many senses to make parties more efficient or more be able to carry out ruling, for instance, transparently, that might be very useful. It might lead to people engaging in politics, but the remedy that is often sought after in this tradition is rather that the parties engage in ideological conflict, appeal also to their base, and not only try to seek out short-term electoral gains, and make politics meaningful in that sense again. And unfortunately, I don't think I can give a single good example of this, but it was a thing I thought about concerning what the other panelists here brought up.
Thank you very much, Oskar. Others who want to address this issue, good examples of reform?
I will probably, can I go next, Magnus?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to mention an example of German political parties. It was in the first part of 90s when German political parties, by the internal statute, adopted procedures in accordance to which in the governing bodies they had to have at least 50%, maybe initially 30, but then 50% representation of women. And after some time, it has actually garnered quite a good result in terms of making political parties more diverse. And a very interesting example I encountered during the previous Bundestag elections when I spoke to someone who was successfully elected in Bundestag from a fairly big city in Germany. She was a Latvian citizen and only 10 years ago moved to live and work in Germany. And she was actually put on the majoritarian candidate list for SPD, a rather established party, which you would very often regard as a party of traditions and of mobilized membership. But when I asked her how did she, as a young East European Latvian woman, succeeded to really be in a prominent place, she said that in general, in the regions, the party membership is not that active and mobilized. And if someone is really vocal and having a strong platform, it is rather inclusive and open to being able to move up. Of course, the big advantage was that she worked in the field of labor rights, and she was a labor rights lawyer. So, of course, this very much corresponded to the platform. But basically, I think that this is definitely a very good example of where we see that the need, the pressing issues of the day of declining membership make parties, especially in the regions, more open to such upward mobility. And that is definitely pleasing to see that this can also be the more traditional parties and not only the newly established millennial projects, so to say.
Thank you very much, Lolita. Birgitta, a brief answer?
Super short. I mean, no women, no change, to build on what Lolita said. And we would not have 25%, that's far too low, female parliamentarians in the world without internal voluntary party quotas. I mean, that's, I would say, the major change. And here I also have to admit that the new political actors, the new movements, they are not better than the old school parties when it comes to promoting women. So everything new is not more feministic.
Thank you very much, Birgitta. We will end the questions there in interest of time. I want to thank all of you for discussing this issue, which I feel is particularly important. In my personal sense, the discussion often gets stuck on the concept of the mass party, which in my view, it was a phenomenon that existed in some European countries, far from all, from the 1940s, 50s until about the 1970s. That's it. It's long gone and it's not coming back. So what we need to discuss is what is the alternative and what is the role of political parties in the protection of our democracies and in ensuring continued participation and representation. So we've come to the end of our time together. I want to thank all of our panelists for your contributions. I want to thank all of you for participating. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this event and my IFES colleagues for preparing and managing this discussion. The next installment in this discussion series will be on February 24th. Write that down in your calendar. And then we will focus on the inclusion of ethnic, national, religious, and linguistic minorities in the political processes and elections in European countries. So I look forward to seeing you all in that discussion. And until then, stay safe.